Interested in being a teacher in the future, will you please fill out one of these surveys and turn it in as the directions say? We're trying to reconfirm our list of teachers. And one of the things that we're really blessed with here in this congregation is a long list of really talented people who can teach. But we want to validate that we have everybody on our list as possible teachers who want to teach and so that we can use their ability to teach the Lord's Word here. So if you haven't filled out a form already, please get one and fill it out, turn it in, and then we'll be following that up with some other announcements about the ways that we're going to assist you in using your skills as a teacher in the classroom. Please fill out a survey. Thank you.
Okie dokie. Hi, folks. Thank you for your patience with video last week. I was out of town and just couldn't get back. I want to quickly start this week because a couple weeks ago, somebody asked me what I was using for this class, for like the information and stuff. And they specifically asked if I was using the Archaeology Study Bible. Quite frankly, I haven't seen my Archaeology Study Bible in a month. I have no idea where it is right now. So if you see it, please let me know. I want it back. But I do think that the Archaeology Study Bible can be helpful. It has pictures. The issue is, it doesn't name its sources well. It'll give you good little snippets, but if you're trying to find out what an actual artifact is, or maybe what a translation of it says, the ESV does not always give you that information. I do know that nowadays, many times, if you have a smartphone, you can use your phone to take a picture of something and then have Google search for like images. I have used that trick before to find something that the ESV Study Bible did not label the way I wanted them to label it. So it is a helpful resource. I also wanted to make you aware of this. This is the InterVarsity Press Bible Background Commentary on the Old Testament. It's a little more fleshed out than a study Bible until it gets to one of the hard parts, and then they just don't mention it, and so that makes me mad. But it's good, and then I would highly recommend this to you: the Old Testament use of the Old Testament. When it comes to identifying where something falls chronologically, there's a lot of different discussions about how we approach how to date how a text reads. But one of the things that is possible with tools like this is to discuss what literature it depends on, right? Nothing quotes to be or not to be unless Shakespeare has already been written. You know, wherefore art thou Romeo does not come from your grandmother, right? It comes from something older. And so you can track dependencies. You can see the parts of the Bible on which other pieces of the Bible tend to make the most use. And that is helpful, can be helpful for this line of thought, tracking this line of thought and influence across biblical authors. So be aware of this. Now, it is time to jump into the Neo-Babylonian period. And why is this called the Neo or the New Babylonian period? It's because all the old Babylonians are gone. We're talking Hammurabi, like time of Abraham kind of stuff. Middle Bronze Age is when the old Babylonians are. They wouldn't say they were the old Babylonians, but we do. And so there was another time in history that we're covering today, when there was a resurgence of Babylonian control in the ancient Near East, when they got back on top. And this is called the Neo-Babylonian period. And this is the time period of biblical production that we're looking at today. Now, the Neo-Babylonian period itself covers 620 to 539. We're not actually going all the way to 539 because we don't need to. But you remember, 539 is when Cyrus the Great declared himself king of the new Achaemenid dynasty in Babylon, the start of the Persian period, right? So we aren't going to go all the way back to that date. But, yes, so the first part of this period can be related to the last few decades of the southern kingdom of Judah. Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah are the last kings of Judah, and we will use them as anchor points for a lot of this so we don't lose track of where we are in a more unfamiliar history. So in terms of Israelite history, then, the geopolitical window we call the Neo-Babylonian period starts during the reign of King Josiah, during his reign, which has again been estimated to about 640 to 609 BC. When Josiah would have been about 17 years old, around 631, the long-reigning Assyrian king Ashurbanipal died. And Assyrian politics were heavily shaken because he had been seen as a strong and stable leader. By 627, one of Ashurbanipal's sons, Sin-Sharish-Kun, took his seat on a coveted throne. It was around this time that Jeremiah began his prophetic ministry. To be clear, there were only about 54 years between the beginning of Josiah's reign and the end of the kingdom of Judah. And Jeremiah was actively prophesying for most of that time and beyond after the kingdom of Judah was over. His ministry seems to have been heavily shaped by the fact that Josiah was the southern kingdom of Judah's last Orthodox king. As far as keeping the law and worshiping Yahweh were concerned. The rest leaned into paganism. So the next year, in 626 BC, when King Josiah of Judah was about 22, Nabopolassar declared himself king of Babylon. It was a city that had been under Assyrian control, but Nabopolassar led a rebellion against the city of Babylon's resident Assyrian governor. You remember how in the New Testament the Romans had stationed these governors in Egypt and in Syria. Well, they weren't the first. There was an Assyrian governor who was stationed in Babylon, and this fella, Nabopolassar, overthrew him and declared himself the first king of Babylon. The same year, Nabopolassar captured most of the city of Nippur. Nippur is right there. So here's Babylon, and he just hopped over to and captured and lost the city of Nippur. In 625, the province of Elam stopped paying tribute to the Assyrians because of Nabopolassar's influence, and the city of Dur joined in Nabopolassar's rebellion. In 623, Sin-Sharish-Kun recaptured the city of Uruk from Nabopolassar. So in Josiah's early years, this back and forth between the Assyrians and the Babylonians were probably notable foreign headlines for King Josiah. What's going on in the world? The Assyrians have done this. The Babylonians have done this. Back and forth it went. Domestically, however, Josiah had other concerns. It seems to be around this time that the prophet Zephaniah was active. And he was burdened with a disturbing message. If you've read the book of Zephaniah recently, you get the tone, right? Yahweh was going to destroy the world as they knew it, including Jerusalem, Philistia, Moab, Ammonite territory, Ethiopia, and Assyria. According to Zephaniah, it's all going down. Now, Zephaniah's last recorded sentiment, if you read his document, is a hopeful one, but it in no way precluded the judgment that God had decided to carry out on Jerusalem plus. It was everything around them was going down with them. Now, interestingly, Zephaniah was led to highlight the downfall of Nineveh, an event that would take place within a decade, but we'll get to that. In about 622, which is perhaps around the year that Josiah's restoration work on the temple resulted in finding the text of the law of Moses, an Assyrian general also revolted against Sin-Sharishkun. So he had problems, the king of Assyria had problems within and without. This Assyrian general stole the capital of Nineveh right out from under him, and Sin-Sharishkun was forced to abandon his war with Nabopolassar and focus on reclaiming his throne in Nineveh. So he was fighting down here, he had to say bye and go back up. Nabopolassar was then all the more free to continue his assault on the Assyrian power structure for several years. And this is what is going on in the wider world while Josiah is carrying out this religious reformation in Judah that's based on this rediscovery of the law. One might infer that when Zephaniah preached his message, it could have been before Josiah's reformation, right? It's just such bad news. Surely finding the law would have put like a stopper in that. But this is not necessarily the case. Contemporary to or slightly after Zephaniah came Habakkuk, who decries what it's like to live in Jerusalem and have a heart for God's will in that city. He is tormented by the unrighteousness around him. Tormented. He, perhaps not unlike how the much later author of the book of Hebrews described how Lot once felt living in Sodom. Like, you just read the first chapter of Habakkuk, and the very first is, why are things like this? And when are you going to do something about it? And then Habakkuk and the Lord have a conversation about that. But Yahweh enforced the same promise the same promised eventuality to Habakkuk as he proclaimed through Zephaniah. Jerusalem would be held accountable for her sins. But in his message to Habakkuk, God shared explicitly that God would be using the Babylonians, known to Habakkuk as the Kasdim. That's specified in chapter 1, verse 6 of Habakkuk. He would be using the Babylonians as his instrument of judgment. Now, at this point, the Babylonians, they're all the way over here. They are on the other side of a desert, other side of the Fertile Crescent, and they've got their own thing that they're doing. But Habakkuk had to deal with this tense fact that it was going to be a little while before this happened. But as Yahweh told him, chapter 2, verse 3 of Habakkuk, it hastens towards the goal, and it will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it will certainly come. It will not delay. Indeed, the Babylonians were slowly becoming such a force as could carry out God's word. About 616, goodness, did I miss that much? Gadzooks. So about 616, Nabopolassar finally fought his way into Assyria proper. What we have here is a picture of a cuneiform tablet that's currently in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. This is a cuneiform tablet sent from the Assyrian king, Sinsharishkun, to Nabopolassar, in which he repeatedly calls Nabopolassar the king my lord, and essentially proposes a truce, a ceasefire. We do not have Nabopolassar's response, but given how history played out, he apparently did not agree to the terms. Nabopolassar just keeps on fighting. So the next year, he tried and failed to conquer in 616. He tries and fails to conquer the Assyrian religious capital of Ashur. And that same year or the next, the Medes get involved. These guys over here, you're normally going to hear them mentioned in the Medo-Persian Empire. But the truth is, they were helping the Babylonians first. So the Medes, who had just sat over here on the edge of Assyrian territory, they took advantage of Nabopolassar's chaos, and they ganged up on Assyria. This was a geopolitical game changer. In approximately 614 BC, the Medes carried out their own attacks on Nimrud, which is, I've lost Nimrud. Where are you? I hate it when I lose entire places. It's so annoying. Well, is Nimrud not on my map? That would be triple annoying. But either way, they take Nimrud, or they attack Nimrud and Nineveh, and they captured a place called Tarbisu, and they captured Ashur. So they achieved momentarily, well, pretty powerfully actually, they achieved what Nabopolassar, the Babylonian king, had failed to do. So Nabopolassar promptly makes an alliance with them. How about we take on the Assyrians together? And he did this with a treaty that was made around the marriage of his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, to Amytis, the daughter of the Median king Caesares. So, by the might of the combined Medo-Babylonian army, Zephaniah's prediction of the fall of Nineveh came to pass in 612 BC. Nineveh was left in ruins. After that pivotal victory, the Medes undertook such a harsh campaign against other Assyrian settlements that the Babylonians were now actually only left with a handful of diminished cities to rule in the area. The population of the Assyrian heartland would not recover until almost a century later, when the Persians were in charge and repopulated it. The Medes destroyed them. The Assyrian political machine, however, was not entirely dead. What remained of Assyrian administrative power fled from Nineveh up to Haran. And you'll remember Haran from the Old Testament had been around for a good long while. That's where Abraham settled for a good bit. That's where Abraham's daddy stayed. But yes, they moved up to Haran, from whence they called upon Egypt for military help. They just wanted Egypt to come up the coast and help them, and I'm sure the plan was, we're just going to take all this back. But that did not happen for the Assyrians. So the Pharaoh at that time, Santik I, had long been an ally of the Assyrians. But his forces, when they showed up, they just didn't make a meaningful difference in this case. By about 610, the Medo-Babylonian army also conquered Haran. Seemingly this same year, Pharaoh Santik died in Egypt and was succeeded by Pharaoh Necho II. Necho spent the next few years taking up his predecessor's lost cause to aid the dying ember that was the Assyrian army and its king. It was in one of his earlier campaigns to fight the Babylonians around 609 BC that Necho killed Josiah. Necho killed King Josiah, who, for reasons I do not know, got it into his mind to try to block Necho and his forces from crossing the valley at Megiddo. That's in 2 Kings 23 and 2 Chronicles 35. That is, if you were wondering what the Pharaoh was ever doing on the way up, he was on his way to fight against the Babylonians for Assyria. Josiah got in the way. Arrow kills Josiah. But Pharaoh Necho tolerated Josiah's son Jehoahaz as king of Judah for only 3 months before imprisoning him in Egypt. Necho appointed and renamed Josiah's next son Jehoiakim as the new king of Judah, who dutifully paid tribute to Egypt. So under Pharaoh Necho II, Judah effectively became a vassal of Egypt. They had been a vassal of Assyria. Assyria became essentially non-existent, and the Pharaoh took control of the Jewish state. The timing could not have been worse, but in terms of God's plans, it could not have been more providential. Had Josiah not interfered with Necho at Megiddo, the combination of the Assyrians' failure and the status quo that existed between Egypt and Judah conceivably could have given Josiah room to establish Judah as an independent kingdom alongside his attempted religious reformations. Had he been more restrained and patient, he simply could have outlived the last remnants of the Assyrian Empire and maintained neutrality with Egypt. He might have even been in a position to negotiate diplomacy with the Babylonians when they showed up. But Josiah did get in Necho's way, and the oracles of Jeremiah and Zephaniah and Habakkuk all seem to imply, quite frankly, that Josiah's reforms had a poor reception except where he was directly involved. When he showed up and said, "We're going to do this," it got done. But this was not a self-propelling machine that he started. It started and essentially stopped with him as a good and faithful man, which is sad, but that's the way it was. Had Josiah survived, there is little to suggest that the Babylonians would have found the kingdom of Judah as some righteously compelling nation like they eventually would find a young boy named Daniel. Daniel was a different animal from the last few generations of the kingdom of Judah. They were now attached at the hip with the last friend of the Assyrians and the last enemy, keeping the Babylonians from enjoying their complete overthrow of the Assyrian Empire. So Necho met the Babylonian prince, Nebuchadnezzar II, in battle at Carchemish in 605, in the 4th year of King Jehoiakim's reign over Judah. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Egyptian army. Nebuchadnezzar is Nabopolassar's son, just to keep that straight. But right around the same time, Nabopolassar, who had been letting Nebuchadnezzar take over the war, Nabopolassar died in Babylon. The wide recognition of his father's leadership, along with his victory over the Egyptians at Carchemish, allowed Nebuchadnezzar II to become king in Babylon without dispute. And his daddy had gotten him a good swath of Assyrian territory to inherit. After that, he began working his way towards Egypt. So all this is now Nebuchadnezzar's, thanks to the progress that he and his dad made when they had just started down in here. Within a generation, the Babylonians had taken all of this with the help of the Median army. But He began working towards Egypt, the last holdout of Assyrian faithfulness. As he gained control of the eastern Mediterranean coast, King Jehoiakim did try switching sides, but he botched it. When Nebuchadnezzar would have first arrived in the area in 604 BC, Jehoiakim presented himself as loyal. Smart move, and he did that for the next 3 years. It took Nebuchadnezzar 3 years to prepare his assault, his direct assault on Egypt. And when he tried it in 604 BC, he failed. And Jehoiakim switched sides back again to Egypt upon Nebuchadnezzar's failure. This was a mistake. When Nebuchadnezzar returned in 597, which you'll notice is the last date for Jehoiakim as king, Jehoiakim didn't get a second chance. Judah had shown itself disloyal to the Babylonians, and it was in the way of Nebuchadnezzar's designs on Egypt. So Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem in 597. We know very little about this particular first attack, except that it involved taking Jehoiakim captive and taking some measure of loot out of the temple. We don't know how much, but that's recorded in 2 Chronicles 36. Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiakim, was allowed to succeed his father, but Nebuchadnezzar only tolerated that situation for 3 months and 10 days, according to 2 Chronicles 36. Jehoiakim was 18 years old and was apparently resistant enough to being ruled by his father's captors that Nebuchadnezzar ordered now a proper siege of Jerusalem. So, Nebuchadnezzar exacted a decidedly heftier toll the second time that he came to Jerusalem for this second generation rebellion. He took Jehoiakim captive, and 10,000 Judahites in total were deported out of Judah, and further looted the temple. It seems that the prophet Ezekiel was part of this deportation group. That is why in the opening chapters of Ezekiel, you can read about him getting news, getting visions about Jerusalem, things that are going to happen to Jerusalem, information between exiles and such. It's because the big fall hadn't happened yet. Ezekiel ended up in Babylon years before Jerusalem actually fell, almost a decade. And his prophetic career was about 20 years. So that's like half his time is almost before Jerusalem even finally falls. But that's why the beginning chapters of Ezekiel have so much to say about the fall of Jerusalem as if it hadn't happened yet. Him getting a vision that the glory of God is going to depart from the temple, well, that's because it was still going to. In any case, it is possible that these events, the 597, the second attack of Nebuchadnezzar, also occasioned the composition of the first poem of Lamentations. Don't know if you've realized this, because I kind of learned it pretty recently, as in some time within the last 24 hours. But Lamentations is actually a collection of 5 different poems. They are, the first 4 are written in an acrostic form. Like Psalm 119, there's a section for every letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and the third one actually does it in triplicate. And then the 5th one does not have an acrostic structure. But if you look closely to the history, the different poems of Lamentations actually reflect different stages of the fall of Jerusalem. The first poem of Lamentations, which equates to chapter 1, speaks particularly about the removal of Jerusalem's population and mentions the plundering of the temple. At the end of his attack in 597, Nebuchadnezzar appointed an uncle of Jehoiakim, And so if that's on his father's side, this is another one of the late King Josiah's sons. And changed his name from Mattaniah to Zedekiah, which I think would mean Yahweh is righteous. Zedek is righteousness, right? Yes, Zedek is righteousness. So, but interesting that he didn't force him to take a Babylonian name. Actually, I found that very, very interesting. But that's free with your tuition. Anyway, Zedekiah kept the Babylonian peace in Jerusalem according to Nebuchadnezzar's wishes for 9 years until he got sick of the Babylonians and rebelled until maybe 589 or 588. That year, whichever one it was, Nebuchadnezzar returned. I forgot to tell you about this. This is a tablet. This is called the Neo-Babylonian Chronicle Tablet 5. There are actually a bunch of Neo-Babylonian Chronicle tablets. It's part of a large collection. This one, however, happens to describe part of Nebuchadnezzar's first siege of Jerusalem in 597, where Jehoiakim is taken captive. Year 7 in Kislev, the king of Babylonia called out his army and marched to Hatu, which is what the Babylonians called the southern Levant, Syria, Israel, Judah. He set his camp against the city of Judah, which would be Jerusalem. And on the 2nd of Adar, he took the city and captured the king. He appointed a king of his choosing. Ta-da! He appointed a king of his choosing there, took heavy tribute, and returned to Babylon. So, there you go. But that is now, by the way, in the British Museum. Go to London, peek at it. Yes. Then you have the Jehoiakim ration tablet. This is much more fragmentary, unfortunately. But the key part of all this chicken scratch that they managed to get on that clay is 10 seahs of oil to someone Yakin, king of Yehuda, king of Judah. That would be Jehoiakim, king of Judah. 2.5 seahs of oil to the 5 sons of the king of Judah, and 4 selah to 8 men from Judah. So Jehoiakim, he was at least getting his olive oil. That's good news when they took him prisoner. I love olive oil. I hope he did, because he sure was getting a lot of it. But then Zedekiah. We got to get to Zedekiah. Zedekiah behaves for 9 years and then rebels, right? Just like Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim before him. So, that year, Nebuchadnezzar returned to eliminate Judah entirely as a central administrative settlement and undermine any morale that might be related to the city itself. The final siege of the city lasted for 2 years and was accompanied by a major famine, as described in 2 Kings 25. This period, the famine period during the siege, might have seen the composition of the second poem of Lamentations, which highlights a period of starvation in Jerusalem. The third poem, which focuses on hope in God's mercy against persistent and present suffering, might have also been prompted by this period, by this 2-year window. But it doesn't have to be. Once Nebuchadnezzar's forces finally entered the city after a 2-year siege, they burned down Solomon's temple, the royal palace, all the elite houses, and destroyed the city's fortifications. Gone. These are the fortifications, the walls and gates that Nehemiah will eventually come back in the next stage and build, right? Rebuild. This is why we have to have Zerubbabel and Joshua build a new temple. This is why we need a new priesthood that Ezra whips into shape. But this is the early part. This is where it's all going to pot. They also finally finished looting the temple the Babylonians finally finished looting the temple of seemingly any remaining object of value and executed the people attached to Zedekiah's administration, plus another 60 men that happened to be in the city at the time. Reflection on these events seems to have prompted the composition of at least the last two poems that make up Lamentations, if not the third as well. It's also possible that this was the period in which Obadiah originally proclaimed his prophetic message. The strongest reason to date Obadiah to this period is its affinity with Jeremiah 49, and we'll have to skip this little tablet. And I will just point you, I'll give you the references. I've highlighted, if you want to speed read, I've highlighted the linguistic commonality between Obadiah verses 1 through 4 and Jeremiah 49, 14 through 16, and the commonality between Obadiah 5 through 8 and Jeremiah 49, 9 through 10. And while verse 7 actually comes first in Jeremiah, it matches the bottom part of Obadiah verse 8. So it's uncertain who referenced who, but they are in lockstep when they're talking about this stuff. So that's the best reason to date Obadiah to the Babylonian period. Now, you'll note that here are the biblical documents that we are really dealing with today. Zephaniah, Habakkuk, Lamentations, Obadiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, who we briefly mentioned, and 1st and 2nd Kings. You'll note that most of the biblical documents written during the Neo-Babylonian period were prophetic. When it comes to the prophetic books of the Old Testament, we're faced with the difficulties of having the preserved words with very little explanatory commentary. It's just the oracle this, the oracle this, the oracle that came to the prophet. And sometimes you get little headlines of what was happening, often not. At least some prophets, and well, this brings up the question of how do we have these? At least some prophets certainly did write down their own assigned messages. The books of Isaiah, Habakkuk, just in terms of the Bible in general, Isaiah, Habakkuk, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel all feature moments where God tells the prophet, write this down. And other times the text uses the first person, which means we're dealing with a fragment that the prophet definitely wrote themselves. However, it is equally probable that people who heard them wrote down things that they said. Such as Jeremiah's loyal scribe, Baruch, remember? Jeremiah had like a very loyal scribe who seems to probably be the one responsible for essentially the entire book of Jeremiah, that whole prophetic journal. In any case, it's also possible that still other scribes were responsible for gathering up all the things that people had actually written from a given prophet's career and putting them into the books as we have them now, which has bunches and can span decades of a prophet's work. If we imagine that any biblical prophet was ever satisfied, for instance, writing down their oracles in more than one place, on more than one scroll, on more than one tablet, the evidence suggests that someone unknown to us at some point came along and brought it together. We can't rightly claim to identify such people with certainty, but history allows us to consider the time period in which these things would have been undertaken. Which brings us to the why we have these books. We established last week that the Persian period was a literarily productive episode for the Jews because they were working on reestablishing themselves as a nation, getting the temple set up again, getting the priesthood straightened out again, getting the temple city built again. It also seems that there was a big literary push at the beginning of the exilic period. The population of the kingdom of Judah is becoming separated from their promised land. And like the population of the northern kingdom of Israel before them, God brought about a punishment of removal. With the exile, their heritage and cultural history, the knowledge of their history as Yahweh's chosen people, was going to suffer loss. There are a few, we're running out of time. They even double pressed it just so I would stop. It's so mean. But We can talk about scribes that might have wanted to make sure these things survived, priests that might wanted to make sure these things survived, people like Baruch who were attached to God's good prophets who wanted these things to survive, and even people in the administration who ended up in Babylon proper who wanted these things to survive. The very fact that these books exist for us, that, Ezra and Nehemiah and all these things lean so heavily on the law, means that there were some repentant people in this exile who responded to it by trying to keep as much a hold on God's word as possible. And this is probably when 1st and 2nd Kings were written. That goes through, and 2nd Kings doesn't know about the return from exile. It stops at the reality that the exile happened, which pushes it to before the Cyrus decree. But notice that all the kings in 1st and 2nd Kings are judged spiritually, not according to the paganism that actually caused the kingdom of Judah to fall. There's some repentant and thoughtful people, at least one person or more, behind really evaluating, how did we end up here? How did the exile happen? And it prompts, an entire spiritually judgmental record of the royal history of Israel after, from the days of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. But ultimately, a short version, we're looking at a window of about 63 years or more when all of these books are written. Zephaniah is contemporary to Josiah. Ezekiel is contemporary to the first decade of Babylonian attacks, of Babylonian control over Judah, and then 1st and 2nd Kings get written after. So all these things get written about 63 years, somewhere between 625 and 562 BC. Are there any questions? The Ark of the Covenant or Noah's Ark? I am now going to read to you the most important Bible verse for archaeologists. Many of you, as Christians, probably have encountered the position that John 3:16 is the most important Bible verse for Christians. However, Jeremiah 3:16 is the most important Bible verse for archaeologists. Here we go. Ahem. In those days, Jeremiah's talking about the good stuff that will happen after the exile is over. In those days, your population will greatly increase in the land. At that time, says Yahweh, people will no longer talk about having the ark that contains the Lord's covenant with us. They will not call it to mind, remember it, or miss it. No, that will not be done anymore. So let it go, folks. Obey the word of the prophet Jeremiah and let it go. Elsa style. Okay. Any other questions? By the way, the Egyptians actually could have destroyed it beforehand, but that's not necessarily true. Other questions? Okay.
But a lot of people who study history and the writings in the Old Testament, especially, talk about the influence of culture, the secular culture, on the writings of scriptural.